Hello, my name is Stephen Minnis, and I'm joined today by Professor Fiona de Londras. Fiona de Londras is Professor of Law at Durham University, as well as a visiting fellow at the Oxford Human Rights Hub. Fiona de Londras, welcome.
Thank you.
We are living, regrettably, in a very active period when it comes to terrorism. In just the last few months, we have seen terrorist groups controlling large amounts of territory, whether that be ISIL, whether it be Boko Haram. Considerable controversy over fighters leaving from Western countries to take part in terrorist actions, threat of lone wolf attacks, and just lastly, the destruction of irreplaceable human heritage in ISIL-controlled areas. This diversity of activity is matched by a diversity of counter-terrorism activities, is it not?
It is. So counter-terrorism and all the activities that go in to that pretty nebulous phrase is, as you said, directed towards trying to address a whole host of different kinds of activity. And it tends to take within it both law and non-law, international law, regional law, domestic law, capacity building, operational protocols, counter-radicalisation, education, institution building, democracy building, regime change. All of these things can come in under the rubric of counter-terrorism, and that's one of the challenges, is that counter-terrorism is effectively defined as all that which is done to counter-terrorism, and terrorism itself is an ill-defined phenomenon or field.
Yes, and you've said before that when lawyers think about counter-terrorism, they think of laws that are passed for this purpose. But actually it goes far beyond what's on the books in any one country or even at the UN level.
It does. So it goes beyond, as you say, what we might call hard law, to include things like sentiment analysis, which is looking at freely available online content, or so-called chatter, in order to try to trace threat levels and activities. It includes a whole host of counter-radicalisation activities, which are everything, can be anything from setting up basketball clubs to setting up community liaison committees to trying to help bring about a regime change. I mean, anything can fall into that rubric. And so lawyers, myself included, will often think about counter-terrorism in the context of counter-terrorism law. And why that is important, it is only a small part of counter-terrorism per se, and that other part is important to contextualise the laws, if nothing else.
Yes, because as you've discussed, there is something of a business of counter-terrorism now, which involves multiple actors in government and the private sector, perhaps actors that involve both private and public elements.
That's right, and by the business of counter-terrorism, I don't mean here business in a kind of a profit-generating way, although countering terrorism is also a business. It's a developing modalities and technologies. It's a massive industry, but the business or the practice or the everyday activity of countering terrorism involves everyone from prime ministers to soldiers, to priests and rabbis and imams, to teachers, to companies, and it is really something with a really very striking breadth or wingspan in terms of the actors that are involved in it.
To take just one strand of this breadth, counter-radicalisation, that's a good example, isn't it, of how many different actors are involved in the enterprise, and perhaps where sometimes it can be quite opaque in terms of who is actually behind these endeavours.
That's right. I mean, in some contexts we will have, let's say, community activities or institutions or entities where the government or the state is represented, and it's wholly unproblematic from a counter-radicalising perspective. But, and this is simply a product of logic, if you are trying to divert people from what we now call radicalisation, which is not an unproblematic term, we're trying to divert people from radicalisation in a context where you have low levels of social cohesion, a lack of feeling of faith in or affinity to or belonging to the state, a suspicion of state power and justice and the counterterrorism narrative, then you're unlikely to succeed if you have the state sort of front and centre in what you're doing. So sometimes the state will fund an entity entrusted to shape its own message, or indeed the superstate, an international institution, would do that. Sometimes things are presented as institution building or rights building or education or community relations that have as at least one part of their rationale a counter-radicalising motive or motivation, which is not made manifest.
And there's also a horizontal breadth, isn't there, across different areas of law? If you're talking about trying to identify the autonomously radicalised individual, the internet will often play a large role. It may not just be a community intervention.
Quite.
So this presents, again, another challenge both on the operational side but also on the accountability side.
It does. And I think the internet has really begun to take a central role in the ways in which we, by we here I mean, I guess, states and superstate institutions think about how to address terrorism. And arguably, or at least it is said, also takes a central role in how terrorist organisations try to recruit, radicalise, train, and also explain. So in some contexts, entities or organisations will use the internet to publish how much X, Y, or Z attack cost, for example. So they're sometimes quite transparent in that way as well, which is very interesting. Phenomenon. So yes, the internet is seems to be seen at least as being extremely important here, and that raises, as you say, a whole range of questions. How can we address internet governance through law? How can we, and if we can't, what other options are there? What are the challenges to transparency of what I have called before non-contractual co-option, so where states simply ask internet companies to do something and the internet company agrees, superweighting certain kinds of results or removing content from the internet or what have you. It raises really enormous challenges, which in many ways reflect the challenges that internet governance scholars have been addressing for years in other contexts as well, the dark internet, sharing of child abuse images, and so on. So the question of the challenge the internet poses is in no way unique to the counter-terrorist context.
Yes, and if we could turn briefly to the international level, where again we see a proliferation of different initiatives, what role does something like the Global Counterterrorism Forum play in bringing together different jurisdictions?
Yeah, so you have these entities that are developed, or institutions or organisations that are developed without any particular clear form but they often or mandate, but with an objective or a function. And it is very often to capacity build. And capacity build means a whole host of things in the context of counterterrorism, anything from sharing best practice to writing and sharing model laws or codes or operational protocols, to actually training each other in different modalities or activities or exercises that might be undertaken in countering terrorism. So they potentially play quite a significant role. Although there are often issues of opacity in figuring out precisely what's going on and why it's going on in that forum rather than in another.
And it raises the question of, well, I suppose the reality of the difficulty of reproducing domestic accountability tools, for example, judicial review.
Yeah, it does. So one of the things that is very challenging is that if we're going to respond effectively to what might be perceived as challenges to rights at the superstate level, then there is, I think, a need to break ourselves out of the tendency to want, as you say, to reproduce what we are used to seeing or conceiving of as accountability mechanisms at the domestic level.
Yes.
There are a number of reasons. First of all, the institutions just don't work the same way. Secondly, trust, interstate trust, is a really big issue. And while you might break down trust domestically between a review body or an oversight body and a state agency, getting states to share information with some transnational entity or with each other is a whole different kettle of fish. So in this context, some kind of innovation is potentially required to try to produce accountability mechanisms at the transnational level, although they would almost certainly have to be designed in a cooperative manner, that is, in order to work in cooperation with domestic mechanisms.
And when we look at the options for grounding counter-terrorism at the transnational level in a broader framework of development of human security, what potential is there in the emerging concept of human security at the UN level?
There is both potential and risk in it from a counter-terrorist context. Part of the potential of thinking about countering terrorism in a context that recognises and values and tries to create human security is the potential to build some long-termism into the making of counter-terrorist policy and law. Because the human security narrative is a long game, right? It's trying to reduce inequality, reduce poverty, increase education, opportunity, meaningful participation, build stronger institutions, and so on. And when we think about the root causes of terrorism, as have been revealed by sociological research in particular, we see that those kinds of objectives align well with mechanisms we might think would address root causes of terrorism. And so what's the risk? Because this all sounds super. The risk, I think, is in the hijacking or co-option of the narrative of rights and the concept of rights, in their becoming securitized and instrumentalized, or more instrumentalized maybe, rather than having a kind of an autonomous resilience and normative force, regardless of whether or not they contribute to security per se. So this is a quandary that we really need to try to address as scholars. What are the opportunity costs of engaging with that narrative? And what are the opportunities also of engaging with that narrative?
And just finally, in September this year in New York, we'll have the culmination of the Sustainable Development Goals process, a broader post-2015 development agenda. There is an element of that does treat counter-terrorism. Yeah,
so the broad idea of sustainable development, of course, addresses many of the root causes, as I've said. But then there is also what is currently Sustainable Development Goal 16A, which is about sharing capacity and cooperating to build stronger national institutions in order to reduce violence, conflict and terrorism. So there is something there that recognises the relationship between reducing inequalities, strengthening institutions and minimising violence in a general sense, and terrorism as a particular manifestation of violence.
Well, Fiona,